I'll start Venture Souq kind of on the side with three of my friends. There was a gap in the market. There was a lot of young professionals at the time who wanted to invest in early stage tech, but didn't have a regional platform to do so. So once every couple of months, we would pick interesting entrepreneurs to basically pitch their journeys to a group of our friends. And then we grew organically, quickly grew into the largest syndicate at the time of angel investors. Climate is an area that I've grown a passion towards. I believe it's the largest economic opportunity for the decades to come. People still think that if you're investing in anything that's climate related, it's still dubbed, in my view, as like philanthropy.
Sonia Weymuller is the co-founder of Venture Souq. Previously, she served as an investment consultant to Acumen's Kawisafi Fund and held roles in commercial development at Turner Broadcasting in Dubai, with Viacom's Emerging Market Strategy Group, and on Microsoft Strategy and M&A team in London. Sonia sits on the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Investing in Gender Parity, serves on the board of advisors of the Sharjah Entrepreneurship Center Shara, and is a jury member and capital mentor for the Cartier Women's Initiative. Sonia holds a BA from Yale University and MSc from the London School of Economics.
How did you build the company to that level? Because you've invested in portfolios across the globe.
I think definitely team is one. The fact that we're all heading in the same direction is important. Maybe there's different motivations behind it. We know that we're walking on the same path. I think in order to be a true kind of conscious leader at a portfolio level, if you're a tech startup founder, it takes a lot of self-reflection. Make sure that you are very clear in A, knowing who the competitors are, and then B, that you have information on these competitors in your presentation as well. If you are unaware of the competitors, that's definitely a red flag for me.
Sonia, thank you for joining me on this podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Temitope.
Right. So why don't we start with the early days? Can you tell us more about the beginning and your journey to how you got here?
Yeah, so I didn't take a linear route to where I am today. I studied politics, undergrad and grad, thinking I was going to be a journalist at the time. Realized how expensive London was, got a job while I was studying, and basically started my career at Microsoft in strategy M&A. That put an end to the journalistic aspirations and started my career in corporate, basically. So I worked with them for a couple of years. Then I joined Viacom in their strategy team covering emerging markets. That's what brought me to the region. My family had actually moved to the region when I was in university in the US in 2004. They'd moved to Bahrain and were there for 20 years. And so, that was kind of my introduction to the MENA region at the time on holidays when I would come visit my parents. And so I decided to move here in 2011 when Viacom opened an office here and continued on with them, then joined Turner, another American conglomerate, while I was here. And meanwhile, started Venture Souq kind of on the side with three of my friends. Two of us went to college together in the States, and then the other two we met in Dubai in 2011. And we started angel investing together. And that was kind of the informal beginnings of Venture Souq. This is 2013, so this is a long time ago. The ecosystem was very different back then than what it is now. And there was a gap in the market. There was a lot of young professionals at the time who wanted to invest in early stage tech, but didn't have a regional platform to do so. So we started hosting informal meetups on the weekends, once a month or once every couple of months, where we would pick interesting entrepreneurs to basically pitch their journeys to a group of our friends. And then we grew organically. Our friends started inviting their friends, etc. Then we quickly grew into the largest syndicate at the time of angel investors, deployed about $30 million through that model. And then it kind of made sense for us to quit our day jobs and be like, okay, well, we're onto something. The ecosystem is evolving and maturing, so let's evolve and mature alongside it. And so by then we deployed the 30 million into over 100 companies globally. And it made sense for us as the ecosystem was evolving to also evolve into a VC, because we built our chops from a deployment standpoint and from a track record standpoint and started pinpointing specific sectors that we felt were underserved from a capital injection standpoint from this region. And so that led us to launch the first fintech fund in the region in 2020. That's backed by all the sovereign wealth funds here. And then we launched subsequent funds after that. And so now we're in our fourth fund.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what started as a passion has become a full-fledged job.
Yeah, I mean, what started as, I would say, an interest at the time, and I think it made sense because each of us founding partners, come from different backgrounds. My background was on strategy, so what I love most about what I do is actually sitting down with the entrepreneurs and figuring out how I can help them in terms of scaling their companies or introductions or going to new markets or fundraising, etc. That's kind of what gets me out of bed. But each of us kind of another partner firm is a lawyer by background, another partner is private equity by background, another partner is an actuary by background. So what's cool about kind of our set is that we come with complementary skill sets. We're not all ex-bankers with the same professional trajectories. So we look at deals in different ways. We can add value to the companies in different ways. And I think that's kind of what makes us special and different, I would say.
Right. So from an aspiration of being a journalist in the media world to telco and now to climate tech, why climate tech?
So climate is an area that I've grown a passion towards. I believe it's the largest economic opportunity for the decades to come. It's also a challenge that climate change is a challenge that's not going to go away. So this is not like a fun, sexy sector to invest in, for quick financial returns. It's here to stay, and I think it's our duty to start injecting capital into the founders that are actually building tech solutions to address some of the ramifications of climate change, whether it be food tech, ag tech, supply chain traceability, energy management, climate risk management, biodiversity restoration. I mean, climate is a pretty wide kind of catch-all term, right? But those are the areas that we really choose to focus on because those are the areas that we've already invested into as a firm as well.
Right. But it seems like, when you talk about climate tech, it just seems like a buzzword, right? I mean, to anyone listening, why does that matter? Why do we need to start thinking about that? Why do we need to start thinking about investment in that area?
Because I think each of us feels it, whether you're sitting in Europe, in the US, in Africa, in the Middle East, in the Southeast Asia, we're all feeling the ramifications of extraordinary weather patterns, for example, whether it be heat waves, whether it be disease spread, whether it be floods happening, right? I mean, this is becoming kind of a daily occurrence, regardless of where you're sitting. I mean, we had flash floods here, right? Like not so long ago. So are the cities that we live in prepared for that? Are the humans that live on this planet prepared for that? And so what are we doing to build these climate adaptation tools? Because this is our new reality now. And so that's why I say, like, this is not going to go away. It's going to get worse, if anything. And so how do we preempt or adapt to these new set of circumstances that we're being faced with as a species? Not to sound dramatic, but that's kind of, it's true, right? Like, I mean, it is affecting us on a daily basis. Every time you turn on the news, you see something happening which is natural disaster related somewhere in the world, right? So I do feel like it's something that everyone needs to start thinking about, whether you work in the government sector, whether you work in the private sector, and definitely if you're an entrepreneur, like thinking outside the box on like, okay, well, how am I going to try and address XYZ basically based on my own area of competencies?
Right. So you've worked on several projects in the climate tech sector, but you mentioned something earlier in terms of, the viability of that sector. It might not be the place where you get your biggest returns. What has been the experience for you?
No, so I think you can get the biggest returns or big returns. There are climate unicorns out there, but I think maybe it takes a bit longer than some other sectors. And sometimes you're dealing with technologies that require a lot of R&D and that are more asset heavy. That's not something that we would invest in as a VC ultimately, because when you look at the investment value chain, there's different players, right? So you have the infrastructure type funders. They're probably better suited for the larger tickets, asset heavy type of opportunities. We're still mainly investing in things that have a software component to it, right? So that can scale more quickly because ultimately we have a fiduciary responsibility to our investors and we have to return funds within a certain time frame, which is basically 10 years, right? So that's also a filtering mechanism in the types of opportunities that we would look to invest in. But ultimately, you need the different pockets of capital, whether it be equity or blended finance or infra, et cetera, in order to help some of these founders build what they're building at different levels, because there's all sorts of different projects that you can choose to support and invest in, right? Depending on where you sit. Yeah.
So in terms of climate tech, if you reflect on some of the projects you've supported, what is that standout project for you?
Well, there's one that's based here that I really like called Seafood Souq. For me, it's a great case study of a company that's built here in the UAE that's already in 40 markets globally, and they do seafood, their seafood traceability digital platform, basically. So do you know where your fish comes from when you go eat at a restaurant here? Not necessarily, right? Are you actually eating the fish that they're telling you that you're eating? You're not sure about that, right? So a lot of the work that they do is around digitizing that entire space within the seafood industry. And so I'm excited about that because it's also an Emirati founder who is a co-founder in the business. He's very passionate about the blue economy, so anything that has to do with the oceans. He's also known as the turtle sheikh because he does a lot of work around the conservation of turtles in the region. And for me, like that's kind of the story that we need in the region, because oftentimes when international investors look at this region, it's like, well, why would I invest in this company that's doing that when, I could invest in a US based company or Europe based company that's in the same. Well, I'm like, well, because maybe this company is actually targeting emerging markets. Maybe it's actually more relevant to the markets that they're choosing to focus on. And it doesn't always have to be Western centric necessarily, right? And so I want to see this company succeed because I think this will be a great case study for us as a region of a company that goes global from the GCC. And we need more of those.
Right, right. Now let's talk about dilemmas that you face in this sector. Is it more an issue of funding, or is it more an issue of finding the right kind of projects?
I don't think we have a shortage of projects. I think we've probably reviewed over 400 deals across the MENA region. Quantity doesn't mean quality necessarily, but they're there, and that means there's a desire and a willingness amongst founders in the region to actually build these types of solutions, right? I think one of the challenges that we face in this region is still this shift in mindset that's required. People still think that if you're investing in anything that's climate related, whether it be biodiversity restoration or supply chain, etc., it's still dubbed, in my view, as like philanthropy, you know? Oh, this is a do-good project. And it's like, no, these are tech-enabled businesses. They're
Right.
commercially sustainable. They're scalable to other markets. Like, you should look at this business like any other business that you look at. And, we have different thematic funds under the Venture Souq umbrella. The way that we due diligence companies on the climate side is exactly the same way commercially that the fintech team, for example, looks at deals. If anything, we just have an added scorecard, which is that impact scorecard. Because in order to make it to the next level of diligence, we need to ensure that the company has the commercial chops to make it on the KPI front, but also has the impact that's scalable to go with it. And so in order to make it to the second stage of diligence, we have the scorecard has to be met on both fronts for us.
Right, right. Now let's talk about Venture Souq, which is the company you are a co-founder. And you mentioned earlier that it was a bunch of young people
At the time,
at the time.
not to date myself.
Yeah, not so old either. So a bunch of young people at the time coming together, spotted opportunities, were able to get investments and invested in these companies. And today it's one of the top 10. In fact, I think in 2024, you were in Middle East, you were top 10 in Middle East. How did you build the company to that level? Something that started as an interest to such a, I would say global, because you've invested in portfolios across the globe.
I think definitely team is one. Founding team, meaning the fact that the four of us, and then we brought on a Saudi partner in 2017. So the five of us ultimately stuck to each other. Tamer was another partner, is my best friend. The fact that, from university, right? So the fact that 12 years into this journey of Venture Souq, we're still best friends, that means something. It's not easy to work with friends. The fact that Sonia and Sunil equally are also very close friends of ours and we're still friends into this, like there's a level of trust, loyalty, respect that we have for each other that's basically reflected in the fact that we've stuck together, right? Like, I mean, 12 years together is a long time. And, been through a lot together as a team, obviously kids, the highs and the lows, the bad and the ugly and the good. So I think team would be one for sure. I think the fact that we don't always see eye to eye, but we have that level of respect for each other. We listen and hear each other out and look to compromise or build towards a similar vision, I think is important. The fact that we're all heading in the same direction is important. Maybe there's different motivations behind it, but we know that we're walking on this on the same path.
Right. So if I may summarize, I hear you've talked about trust.
Yeah.
Then there's the shared vision and the diversity of expertise in the room. For companies looking, or for friends looking at building something, because, a lot of, I'll say, those in the 40s, I'm in my 40s as well.
Yeah.
We're looking at pivoting and, building up businesses. What would you say are the core ingredients of having a partnership that works?
I think if you're looking, let's say, for a co-founder or a partner in a new business venture that you're embarking on, spend as much time as possible with the person that you think you want to do that with, because ultimately it is like a marriage. Like for us, it's 10-year terms for each fund, right? So literally, like when we're committing to a fund, we know that the next 10 years we're stuck with each other, right? And the next fund, and the next fund, and the next fund, right? until we retire, hopefully one day, if we retire. So like my advice would be, if you have identified one or two or three people even, and you want to pick all three or you want to pick one, get to know them beyond just work conversations. Get to know what their core driver and their core motivation is in life. Because even if we bring this back to kind of our portfolio, sometimes when we look at the companies that did not do so well, it's not because the founders didn't have the right background or, were bad people. It's sometimes there's the timing was off, right? So is the timing right? Is the timing right for you? Is the timing right for that other person that you're bringing on board? So timing and I think intentionality and motivation behind wanting to do something together really needs to be thought through. And that takes time. And so I would never advise anyone building any kind of business, whether it be a tech business or any business, to like rush into things, because if you make the wrong decision, it's just a lot more annoying to unwind eventually, right? And so it's better for you to take the time, even if it takes up to a year to find that right person that you really feel like is complementary to what you want to do and build, etc. I think it's worth that time rather than unraveling like 5 years later in an acrimonious way. Yeah.
So let's assume you thought you found the right person and you start business and the other person isn't just pulling their weight. What do you do?
You address it with them. I mean, you don't have a choice, right? If you don't feel like they're pulling their weight, then it's a conversation to be had. And I think, ultimately it'll all depend on the kind of personality and ego that the other person has, right? If the other person is self-aware enough to actually acknowledge, yeah, you're right. Like I'm on the bench, like I've kind of taken a back seat, and maybe there's something in their personal life that's happening you're not aware of. Like, I would approach it with that first, like at least give that person the benefit of the doubt that there's a reason behind why they're taking a back seat. Don't assume that they're doing it in a kind of, yeah, malintentioned way necessarily, right? Because we all have stuff going on in our lives. We're all human beings ultimately. So that would be like my advice is first like start as like, hey, is everything okay? What's going on? Like, etc. I noticed that you're not as you don't seem as motivated as before, etc. And then listen to them out. And maybe it's not the right time for them to continue doing what they're doing. And then hopefully you find kind of a pacifist way of going your separate ways. Yeah.
Empathy and communication. Absolutely. Okay.
I think you have to start with that.
Yeah.
I think oftentimes too many people kind of go into confrontational mode, which is not healthy. And I think even as women, I think we tend to do that as well, because that's our way of asserting ourselves, or we think that's a way of asserting ourselves, right? And that's not necessarily the right way to approach it. And so I think having a more wholesome 360 view of your entire team, whether it be a partner or people that work under you, is important.
Right. Maybe this is a good time to talk about working with women.
Yeah.
Because I know you're a great supporter of women. I met you about 3 years ago,
Yeah.
and you've been so supportive. So, I think you're the best person to talk about that topic. It's sometimes you would hear women say, I don't want to work with women. I'd rather work with men. We don't support each other. What do you think is the cause?
I don't think it's black and white. I mean, I think historically, I've never had a female mentor. If I look at myself, like, young Sonia, from age like 20 onwards, like most of my mentors were male, actually. Sensitive males, empathetic males, compassionate males. So like, I think I picked the right ones, right? And yeah, I think, is there a need for more women to support other women? For sure. But I don't think it's necessarily woman to woman all the time. I think there's a lot to learn from each other as human beings, regardless of gender. And I think sometimes, again, back to the earlier comment, like women feel like they have to be more assertive. I'm not using the word aggressive. I'm using the word assertive.
Right.
And sometimes that goes to their disadvantage. I think sometimes women are pulled to take on this assertive persona when they don't necessarily need to.
True.
And I think that we live in a world, especially with the next generation, so the generation younger than ours, right? Where not all, but hopefully many of the next generation men, for example, understand that empathy, compassion are equally as important. Whether you're building a company or, whether you're, in a relationship, whether, any personal or professional, in order to be a good conscious leader. There's certain traits that female inherently have that I think are necessary. And just like if you talk about energies, like there's some times that we as women have to embrace the masculine energy. I think there's times when men have to embrace their feminine energy as well. And finding that balance, I think, is important.
Right. And I think for me, the last question on that is how can we better champion each other as women? What are their practical ways?
I mean, I think you have kind of a lot of platforms that kind of maybe match women with mentors, etc. But I think keeping in mind again that there's not one mentor for you. And I talk a lot about this. Like for me, it's almost like you're looking for to up together a board for your company. Like approach it in a similar way for mentorship. So you may have a mentor that's like, again, regardless of gender, that's more of a sector expert. You may have one that you actually admire because they're amazing, like like leaders at their respective companies. So there's conscious leadership skills that you want to learn from that mentor. There's one that's maybe more commercial oriented, where you can learn kind of, someone like you, for example, kind of the financial literacy aspect, and so kind of building that out. And it can be women and it can be men. I think women inherently are maybe more open to supporting each other. I think that's my experience, at least. I get some of the women who say that some women are more cutthroat with other women. I personally have not experienced that, but maybe it also has to do with setting boundaries and learning how to set boundaries for yourself. And again, this is vis-a-vis men or women, and kind of what is it that you're allowing yourself to do, or how are you allowing yourself to be treated by men and women? And that's more introspective work that you need to do, right?
Right. And I think, as you mentioned, whether it's women with women or women with men, at the end of the day, we would work with each other.
Yeah.
I think that brings me to my next question on leadership. If there's any leadership lesson that you have learned working with both women and men, what would it be?
I think there's always, I don't know if it's leadership per se, but I guess maybe it's a life lesson, I guess, that feeds into the leadership bit. I think there's always, and we were talking about this earlier, there's always a learning in anything that happens in your life, whether it be personally or professionally. And I think being able to put one's ego aside and accepting, and that takes a maybe faith as well, but like, that there is a learning in whatever shitty situation, pardon my French, whatever bad situation you're in, or you think that you're in,
Right.
or whatever bad conversation you may be having with someone. Like there's always a learning about either the other person or yourself in it. Oftentimes it's about yourself, actually. And so I think in order to be a true kind of conscious leader, which I think is needed if you want to build a successful company, whether it be at a firm level, whether it be, at a portfolio level, if you're a tech startup founder, takes a lot of self-reflection. And, my advice is always like, you need to take that time, at least, I mean, if you're not doing it on, a monthly basis, at least on a quarterly basis, to check in with yourself. Because if you're not going to show up in the right way for yourself, you're not going to show up in the right way for other people around you, whether it be, again, personally or professionally. So I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah.
And that takes me to my question on working with startups and founders. I've heard a lot of VCs talk about getting to know the founders more. They want to know who they're entrusting these investments
Yeah.
with. For you, what are the attributes of standouts founders? And I guess that also snowballs into founders that have been successful, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think like there's, again, a scorecard, a commercial scorecard that all VCs will have in terms of assessing a business. So the numbers, um, based on, kind of traction and performance if they have it. Keeping in mind that for VCs specifically, we invest early. So ultimately, it's about the team.
Mm-hmm.
It's about the founders specifically, which is why the VCs tend to say we want to focus on the founders. I mean, I would argue actually not enough VCs spend enough time getting to know the founders. Like maybe too much time is being spent on data and traction and performance, which is obviously important. But if you're investing early, sometimes they don't have that, right? So really, you're taking a bet on the founder or the founders. And so understanding what's motivating, again, each of the founders, if there are two or multiple ones, I think is important. And also making sure, like, what is their relationship amongst themselves, right? Like how, just like the question that you asked me about me and my co-founders, right? Like that also needs to be reflected in the conversations that we're having with the multiple founders, if it's a company that has multiple founders, because that itself is like its own little microcosm marriage, right? So are they aligned in the values and the way that they want to build businesses is also equally important as to like, what does your commercial model look like and what traction do you have and, what does your sales cycle look like? Okay, all that is great, but it's not going to get anywhere if there's misalignment between the founders behind the business, right? So also like just making sure you spend time individually with each of the founders, I think is also important.
Right. So let's talk about ideas and execution, because you mentioned earlier that a case of lack of projects that come to you, which is heartwarming that there are lots of people out there ideating and coming up with projects. But let's assume I've got ideas, and I want to see this come to life. What would you advise me?
If you're a new founder and if you have your own money, then you would self-fund. If you don't have your own money, then you would probably go to the angels, because in order to get to the VC level, you first need to make sure that you have a product up and running. And that need probably take some initial funding. So either it's self-funded or you get a bunch of angel investors or friends and family around, et cetera, to actually invest in a company that you've already set up, because you would need to set up a company. Don't assume that these funds would go into your personal bank account. Like, I mean, we laugh, but these are conversations that we've had in the past, although the ecosystem has grown a lot in the last decade. But yeah, so you need to set up a company first and actually a bank account in order to raise external funding, if that's the way you have to go. Get the product up and running, ideally get some revenue in already, and then approach the VCs. And then you have different types of VCs. So you have VCs that invest at an earlier stage, like Kutu, for example, Amir Farha. He invests at the pre-seed. That's earlier than what we do, for example. We tend to do more Series A. So it's pre-seed, seed, Series A, Series B, C, D, etc. Right? So we tend to focus more on A, but then you have some funds that focus on pre-seed and seed, for example. So those would be the initial people that you would go for. And so that feeds into, again, another piece of advice specifically for the founders, the tech founders, is just make sure that you research the funds and know exactly who to approach. Because if you're approaching me, for example, with a pre-seed health tech deal, nothing to do with what I focus on, which is climate Series A. So actually will go against you, because then I'm like, okay, well, you clearly don't know anything about what we do, right?
So let's talk about common mistakes that you've seen. You've reviewed lots of projects and you have invested in lots of startups. So what are some of the common mistakes that you've seen that every founder shouldn't make?
Well, definitely know the competitive landscape, because oftentimes when you're pitching your company is like the best and like, it stands out, etc. Okay, that's fine if you make these claims, then back it up. What's your unique selling point? Make sure that you are very clear in A, knowing who the competitors are, and then B, that you have information on these competitors in your presentation as well. Because inevitably, I'm going to say, hey, well, what about these 3 other companies that are doing exactly the same thing that you're doing? So if you are unaware of the competitors, that's definitely a red flag for me. If you're aware of them, but I'm not convinced by what your unique selling point is, that could be another red flag as well. Like, what are you doing? It's fine if there's multiple companies doing the same thing, but how are you doing it better than these other companies? I think that's really important. So that's come about in the past where I've had conversations and they're not aware of competitors, for example. So for me, I'm like, like how much research have you done then on the landscape for your product, right? And whether this product market fit. Another one would be again, back to ego. I think it's fine to be confident and assertive as a founder, but I think it's also equally important to be able to put your ego aside and be receptive to feedback. Um, and again, ultimately, you're the founder, it's your business, or you're the founders and it's your business collectively, right? But if you have already people on your cap table, so the investors that have invested in your business, they are incentivized to see you succeed. So leverage them, pick their brains. Doesn't mean that you have to listen to what they or action whatever they're saying, right? But
Right.
take the feedback at least, right? Because maybe they'll come up with some feedback that you haven't thought about necessarily. And so for me, that takes also kind of putting ego aside, because as a founder, you have tunnel vision, right? And this is what I was building, and this is what I'm going to do, and etc. But sometimes things don't go according to plan necessarily. And so being able to be like, okay, like, let me constantly take iterative feedback from my investors or from customers, etc., I think is important, because maybe the way that you thought this would plan out is actually not planning out the way you thought it would be,
Exactly. Yeah.
And so I don't, I've had, I think, conversations with founders where I felt like they were so kind of one-sided and one-track minded that I question sometimes, like, okay, like, will they be open to pivoting if they need to pivot? Or are they going to stick to their guns and go, go, go? And sometimes it's good to stick with your guns and go, 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 but sometimes it's not. And so having that open-mindedness and that flexibility in your thinking of receiving feedback from others, I think, is another key point that actually is important to me
Yeah.
as an investor as well. And you kind of get that from the conversations that you have. If it's a founder that keeps on talking all the time and you barely have time to like insert a word, then like you want to be with someone who obviously is charismatic and can talk through, what they're doing, etc. But you also want someone who practices active listening. on both sides, by the way, both the investor and the founder side, right? So has that space been created for that active listening on both sides to be able to take place? I think is something to think about.
Yeah. And, I was reading the other day about so someone who put it on LinkedIn and said most startups start with plan A, but they end up doing very well when they're at plan D because you've got to pivot. You realize that the idea I started with might not be the idea that your customers want.
Exactly.
Yeah. But you've got to iterate it until you get to what the customers want. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you iterate it, and even like going one step further as you grow as a company, like maybe you're the right CEO or leader for that company from like pre-seed to like a series B. But maybe as the company grows and scales, assuming it does well, like at some point, maybe it's time for you to step aside, and maybe it requires another set of skills from someone else, right? And that's not easy as a founder because it's your baby, right? But sometimes, like, again, back to self-awareness, you need to acknowledge the fact that, okay, I've taken this to where it needs to be. I'll still hold equity in the company, but maybe it's time for some, yeah, to let go and actually some new blood in the company, like, right? And ideally that happens in a pacifist way and a smooth transition as opposed to an acrimonious one. But I think that's something else also that I'm not sure founders really think about because they think that they're in it for the long run all the way to the end. But sometimes maybe you've grown out of it, and you kind of need to either because you've grown out of it for personal reasons or because your skill set is maybe not equipped to take the company to the next level, right? Yeah.
It reminds me of this lady that I won't mention names, but she started this cosmetic company when she was 16-year-old and grew out of being 18 and realized that, see, I don't have that audience anymore because the people that want to use this are still 16-year-old and I'm now 20-something. So it's time to leave and get someone who is that young.
Yeah. And that's not an easy decision to make.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about the pain points that, a lot of founders have. What would you say are the common pain points?
I think scaling. We are incredibly fortunate to be in a very big region from a population. It's like 450 million, right? Overall MENA, right? But it's fragmented. And so, yes, you can start a business out of the UAE, but if you want to scale to Saudi or Egypt or Morocco, it's almost like you're starting from scratch again, right? And you have to set up a new business and like you maybe hire people on the ground, maybe hire a partner on the ground. And so I think scaling like is one challenge because if you look at these individual countries, they're too small, right? You inevitably have to look to go into other markets within the region in order to scale and build a larger business set, right? So I think that's one of the main pain points that entrepreneurs face from different regulations also. So literally it means you have to start almost like not a new company because it's the same company, but it is kind of a new company in a way because it's a new market that maybe has a different set of rules. So that's probably the biggest one, I would say, in terms of pain points. I think like talent acquisition used to be a big pain point. I think what we've seen in the region, especially over the last 5 years, is a huge influx of people moving to the region from the West mainly, and from the East also, to be fair, post-COVID. And so I think from a talent acquisition standpoint, there's more talent here than there used to be in terms of building teams out. Um, so that used to be a pain point that I think is kind of mitigated now or addressed. Um, I think that, if you talk to the entrepreneurs, they'll always say funding is a pain point, which I agree. We're still, I mean, we're definitely way further than we were in 2013 when we started our journey, right? In terms of the different types of investors that you have. Like now we have family offices, we have corporates investing. Obviously, the sovereigns now have allocations towards regional funds, etc. But obviously, we'll always need more.
Right.
More funders to as the number of founders increases, which has happened, right? Like we need more funders as well to be able to match that capital. You can build as many accelerators as you want in the region, but if these founders graduate from these accelerators and don't find capital, they're not going anywhere. So I think that's always why we as Venture Souq have always focused on the investor side of the equation. Investor education has been at the core of our ethos since the beginning. We did a lot of programming for, Qatar Development Bank, Bahrain Development Bank, YPO, etc. Because we understand that if we want to grow this ecosystem in a healthy way, both sides need to be addressed. It's not just about bringing the founders here, it's also making sure that they have the capital and find the capital that they need across the different chapters of their journey as well.
Right. I think I'd like to touch on a very important point, especially for founders and for entrepreneurs. While it might look so rosy and also glam outside, one is building a beautiful business and all that.
Yeah.
But the true journey is what people can't see is the pain, is the twist and all of the not so good parts that you have to go through. It would be nice to share some of your own journey and just to encourage other founders, other entrepreneurs in the same space.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's about timing. Um, when I chose to leave corporate to do Venture Souq, the timing was right. I was at a point in my career where I felt like the learning curve was stagnant. I was not married. I did not have kids. I did not have like responsibilities from that perspective. So I could take the gamble of like, hey, let me do something more entrepreneurial and different. If it doesn't work out, I can always go back to corporate, right? But at least I would have tried because I was what? I was must have been like 27, 28 at the time, right? So it was relatively early, right? So, um, but at the same time, sometimes it's good to try these things out earlier on than later when you maybe feel more of the personal, pressure of providing for a family and all that stuff, right? So, um, grateful that I did. A large part of that was because I lost my dad when I was 25, so I think that also helped shape what I ended up doing in the sense that, being faced with mortality of a parent so early on in life, you kind of realize it sounds cheesy, but how life is short, right? And if you want to take chances, like better sooner than later, right? And so by then I'd obviously spent like 8 years in corporate. So I was like, well, maybe now is the time to actually switch gear and try something different. Um, knowing that if I wanted to go back to corporate, I could. But ultimately, life chose to take me elsewhere, which was to continue on this path. So, yes, far, far away from journalism and political science, which is what I studied. um, but, I'm also a big believer that you end up where you need to end up, and I definitely did not take a linear path to VC. Think most people think, oh, you need to do like work in finance or private equity or like investment banking. I did not do any of that stuff, right? But what I did do is I actually invested with my own money. And that's the best way to learn, actually, is when you have skin in the game. And even if it's small check sizes, right? Um, because you've put money in a company, you want to see that company succeed and you want to understand company inside out, right? And that's how we started, right? And so that's what kind of drove me towards what I ended up doing today, right? But it wasn't like definitely wasn't a linear path of like, and also like I don't have 5-year plans. I often say this to like our interns and our juniors. Like I think some people have 5-year plans. It's fine, respect to those. Like I've never had a 5-year plan because I feel like you kind of miss out on some of the magic of life sometimes if you're like stuck in this like 5-year plan kind of mode. Like, maybe you need to end up somewhere else in life. And if you're closed off to it, it'll never present itself to you, right? Because wouldn't have seen the opportunity necessarily because you're stuck in your pigeonhole. Um, so yeah, so I think, I mean, that's kind of my view on it.
But you had a plan. Maybe not 5 years.
Fine. I think my father's watching from heaven because he was in finance, being like, "Yes, she did it." He always wanted me to become a banker. um, but no, I think as long as you listen, ultimately, what's important to me as a human being, forget Venture Souq, just as an individual, is just making sure that whatever I do professionally is in line with my values. If I feel like I'm moving away from that, then I'm not going to feel aligned and I'm not going to be happy with what I'm doing because we all work hard. If I'm going to choose to spend, 80 to 90% of my time at work, it has to be towards something that I care about. And that means that it has to be reflective of my values as a human being. So this is also why I ended up doing climate specifically because it's aligning with my values. I'm not saying the other sectors are not necessarily, but for me, this is something that is important for us. We're never going to solve it because it's always going to be there. But if we can help adapt to it by supporting the next generation or building solutions around it, who also equally care, probably more than our generation does, about the sector, like it's up to us to actually be there to support that generation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I had this question. I remember being called to talk to um associates back then when I was in the Big Four. And I think that's my next question to you. How do you find your inner peace?
Um, I think just again by ensuring that. So I think I've become very mindful of how I spend my time. And I think that's linked to the inner peace question, because I think, when you're early on in your career, you feel this need to be recognized, and you feel like you need to be at every single event and you need to show face and like all this stuff. I feel like, thankfully, I think I'm beyond that now, where I don't feel that. But I felt it because I felt like I needed to build my reputation, and like people needed to see me and understand what we're doing, and I'm not saying I'm beyond that in the sense that I think I'm a special person now, but I don't feel like I need that anymore. That sense of I need other people to approve me, or even that I so the interesting bit with regards to inner peace is, like, I think whereas before I used to define myself by my work, I don't anymore. So I think, like, whereas before, and it's normal, by the way, it's part of our evolution, personal development wise, right? Is like and maybe you had this when you were working for the Big Four, but I was Sonia from Venture Souq. Like, that was my persona, right?
Not even your surname. It's not Sonia, it's Sonia Venture Souq.
Yeah, exactly. And like over the last 5 years, I would say, like, I am Sonia, and I don't define myself by my firm necessarily, right? I feel like, but maybe my voice was the firm's voice before, whereas now I feel like I found my own voice, and Venture Souq is almost like an outlet to get what I care about the most out there into the world, right? So, Sonia cares about climate, therefore Sonia is going to launch a climate fund, right? Or Sonia cared about impact at the time, right? When we launched our impact fund, Sonia is going to launch an impact fund. So that's something maybe for the audience to just reflect on, is like, do you, audience member, define yourself by your work, or do you feel like you have an identity that's different to that, and do you feel like you're true to that identity? Because I feel like that inner peace comes when you actually recognize and acknowledge and see yourself for who you are, irrespective of your work. Does that make sense?
I think it makes sense. And I think it just brings me to my last question in terms of I think we all have to evolve beyond what we do, our work, to who are we? And how are we going to leave this world? What's the legacy we want to leave behind beyond, who we are? And I think the question is, how can more leaders begin to lead with both passion, purpose, and impact for those who want to do that?
I think for those who want to do that, it's all about self-awareness. I mean, what I think is very refreshing and what gives me hope is when I look at the next generation, even at our firm, for example, they're so much more self-aware than I was when I was like 22, you know? Um, I don't like, maybe it's because of social media, maybe I don't know what it is, but it's really refreshing that I can have these deep, meaningful conversations with a 22-year-old. Whereas, when I think back of myself at 22, I probably would not be having these types of conversations with anyone older than me, right? And so the fact that they're already so open to digging deeper into themselves makes me hope that, they will be the conscious, obviously, leaders of the next generation. Um, yeah, I mean, I think self-awareness applies to everyone, regardless of your age, to be honest. Whether you're 22, whether you're 41, whether you're 61, whether you're in your 70s like my mom, because even at 70, you're constantly evolving, right? So, and then you have all these different identities that you're juggling. Yeah, there's the work identity, then you're a mother, you're a daughter, you're a son, you're an uncle, you're whatever it is, right? And so, but are you like yourself in all this, right? Like, are you staying true to yourself as a mother, as a daughter, as a boss, as an ecosystem builder, as a conscious leader? It's hard sometimes because, like, inner peace for me equals like alignment, right? And so you're trying to align all these different identities that you have, right? And I don't think it's easy to do it. I don't think it's something that anyone figures out, by the way. But I think that's part of what life is.
Yeah, you figure it out with time.
Yeah. But again, that requires check-ins, like, and making sure that you feel like right inside. And it's intuitive, right? So it's something like it's a feeling. It's not like, yeah, and when you're not there. And then are you mature enough and self-aware enough to recognize that if you're not there, you need to do something about it? Because I think a lot of people are not there and don't do anything about it. And then they end up leading miserable life, you know? Yeah.
So thank you so much, Sonia. I think, leaving for me is coming out of this conversation is it's beyond us. We know ourselves, but then how, as individuals, what's the impact that we're making? What's the energy that we are feeding out there? Very important. I think that, basically for me is also as leaders, is what we portray, that energy is also fed by our team. Because if you want high energy team, is also what they see. If they feel that, she's at peace, even as a founder, if they know this founder is at peace, then everybody can be aligned in terms of the objectives and the vision of the organization.
And I think the one word that we didn't mention that we really should is authenticity. Like for me, there are very few people, even when I look at people like that dub themselves as conscious leaders, like, is it a brand that they're trying to portray, or is it them being authentic? And I think like whether you're a founder building a team or you're someone looking to join a startup, like what is the authenticity behind the leadership? I think is very important to reflect on as well.
I think it's just basic. You are unique and you have your own special contribution. That's what you bring to the table.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah,
that's it.
we agree.